but I'm going to give an overview, and then if there are questions that I can answer, detailed questions, I will try to do so. Okay, so basically, I'll move these one at a time. We've all been using different types of fertilizers for a very, very long time. And the purpose of it is to replace nutrients that are taken out by plants. So to restore nutrients which have been depleted from soils. So, and fertilization, it requires both an understanding of the inputs, but also management and understanding of the biochemical processes once it's in the soil. Okay, so there are different types of fertilizer products. There are the manufactured or mined fertilizer products, such as P and K, which are mined as raw materials, and then they are manufactured into fertilizer products. There's guano, which has been used for a long, long time, and there are organic fertilizers such as manures. We also have nitrogen-based fertilizers, and nitrogen-based fertilizers tend to be produced using a process known as the Haber-Bosch process, and this is very, very intensive. And we can see that at the moment with the elevated price for some nitrogenous fertilizer products, because nitrogen basically follows the price of oil, because the raw materials, the nitrogen in this case, is basically taken from the air using pressure swing adsorption processes. So when we talk about fertilizers, we generally classify them in terms of their macronutrient content. And within that, we've adopted a convention which is quite old, because it's based on the convention that was used for burnt rocks. So by that I mean we quantify the individual components, NPK, magnesium, sodium, sulfur, on the basis of their oxidized forms. So when we talk about phosphorus, we talk about phosphorus pentoxide. So we measure it as quantify it and record it as phosphorus pentoxide. Potassium as potassium oxide, calcium oxide, etc. So that's the convention we use. And I'm going to refer to some of these later on. But that would be the convention that we're using. So when we talk about the common agriculture fertilizers, we're generally talking about macronutrients such as NP and K. And within that, there are a number of fertilizer components which are commonly found within existing fertilizers. So we have urea, ammonium sulfate, ammonium nitrate, potassium nitrate, potassium sulfate, potassium chloride, potassium magnesium sulfate, phosphoric acid, superphosphate, and ammonium phosphate. And these are all manufactured products. And they are manufactured and produced chemically. Where's my slide gone? So, and there are a number of advantages to using these conventional fertilizers. First of all, they're designed to be water soluble and plant available. They tend to have a high nutrient density. We can produce them industrially in large amounts, so they're very, very scalable, which should keep them relatively cheap. They're easy to transport, and in particular, they're easy to apply, and their effects are predictable and reliable. But they also have a number of disadvantages. Their high water solubility obviously gives rise to environmental issues. The production process itself has environmental impacts. Mine tailings, production of greenhouse gases, for example. They can contain dangerous amounts of heavy metals. And cadmium is a particular example which we find in rock phosphate. But this is covered under the new legislation. And by and large, they do very little to protect soil quality. So the EU obviously, well, not obviously, but the EU has decided to do something about this. And very recently, they launched what we call the European Bioeconomy strategy. And the basis of this is they want to innovate for sustainable growth. And it's a very, very big plan. It's a very diverse plan, but it certainly impacts on fertilizers. So within this European Bioeconomy strategy, there are 5 main areas for action. And these are production, consumption, waste management, and then secondary raw materials, which are a product of the waste management. And the Commission is also putting in place a number of innovation and investment tools in order to drive this. So as part of identifying the 5 areas of action, they also looked at a number of priority sectors which could benefit from this. And these are plastics, food waste, critical raw materials. And this has implications for phosphorus, construction and demolition, and biomass and bio-based products. So, and I want to talk about the market for secondary raw materials here, because this is one of the key areas for action. And the objectives here were to increase the use of secondary raw material, increase the use of recycled nutrients. And as part of this objective, the EU has revised the fertilizer regulation. And this is sometimes called the new fertilizer regulation, or I refer to it as the fertilizer product regulation. And this came into law by the Commission in December of 2019. And this has a number of implications for both feedstocks that can be used for producing these fertilizers and the components that can be used. So I guess the question that's frequently asked is what organic and bio-based components can be used to make fertilizers? So the regulation, which is called within the EU document, the new EU fertilizer regulation, but it tends to be referred to colloquially as the FPR, or the fertilizing product regulation. And it is going to replace another regulation, which was the regulation 2003, which basically had meaning only for mineral fertilizers. And the new fertilizer regulation comes into play in July of next year. And what it basically does, it provides a mechanism for harmonization of products in terms of safety, quality, and labeling requirements, so that any products which meet the conditions of this new fertilizer regulation can be sold anywhere within the EU single market. So it means that if you want to sell your product in any country and you have a CE mark, then you're not obligated to fulfill, or you can't be obligated to fulfill any additional requirements by member states. However, you can produce fertilizers which don't have a CE mark, and these can still be produced for sale, but in this case, under national fertilizer legislation. So if you want to sell your product in any country within the EU, you will need to comply with whatever regulations are in place within that country. So I guess what we have now is a freedom of choice, because for some types of fertilizers, they will be bulky, they will be expensive to transport, and the market will obviously be much more local. So what are these fertilizing products that form part of this fertilizing product regulation? Well, they're defined as a substance or mixture. It could be a microorganism or other materials, which when we apply it to plants or their rhizosphere or onto fungi, such are mushrooms or their mycosphere, that it will basically has a purpose. And the purpose is to provide the plants with nutrients, or else improve their nutrient efficiency. So it doesn't have to contain nutrients themselves. And this is important. So the fertilizing products under this legislation include fertilizers, which will provide plants with nutrients, obviously, but also other categories of products, such as inhibitors, liming agents, and growing media. So what is a fertilizing product under this regulation? Well, it's basically something which we can CE mark. And a material can only be CE marked if it complies with or if it's in accordance with the FPR. So in other words, that it meets the requirements for the relevant, what we call production function category, and those are defined in Annex 1 of the legislation. It meets the requirements for the relevant component material category or categories, and these are defined within Annex 2. And I have to say, these are very much a work in progress. And even this morning, we got some further updates on some of these component material categories. So this part of the annex is being amended almost on a daily basis. The third requirement is that it's labeled in accordance with the labelling requirements, and those are defined in Annex 3. And fourthly, that it is successfully passed the relevant conformity assessment procedure, and that's defined in Annex 4. And the conforming body for each country is defined, and I think in Ireland it's NSAI. So basically, the legislation, it sets the rules for what will comprise these new fertilizers. And it's important because it sets up a regulatory stage for marketing these throughout the European Union. Now, some of this was already in place for the EU internal market because there was partial harmonization of mineral or mine fertilizers through Regulation 2003, but this is now being replaced. So, and as I said, unlike virtually most products that are legislated within the EU, where harmonization is obligatory, in the case of the new fertilizer regulation, the harmonization is optional. So you can decide to go for a CE mark, or you can decide to operate under national guidelines. But if you want access to the single market, you must have the CE mark. So a lot of the fertilizing products that can be produced from organic waste streams, or maybe, and they may be a combination of organic or inorganic materials, which, and there's a name for those, organomineral. Because these would be manufactured from biodegradable, recycled material, waste from the food industry, etc., from non-animal agricultural byproducts, they may require end of waste clarification or classification. So you may have to obtain end of waste status for these products. The organic fertilizers from animal byproducts, and some of those are readily available on the market, these are excluded from the new EU fertilizer regulation. And because these have a separate regulation of their own, 1069. So if an organic fertilizer is CE marked, it's obviously no longer a waste, and at least within as a waste as defined by the Directive 2008/98. But it should also be noted that if we have a component of a fertilizer and it's used for the manufacture of a finished product, that basically that these can still be considered to be a waste. So if you want to include your material within a new fertilizer product, you first of all have to obtain end of waste status. And to some extent, it appears that the fertilizing product regulation, which is trying to bring products to the market, is pulling in a different direction to the waste rule. So if I could give you an example, it's possible to use sewage sludge as an input material for waste, for these new fertilizers. And this can be precipitated as a salt. So we can precipitate the phosphorus as a salt, as described in what we call CMC 12 or component material category 12. So this can now become a component of a fertilizing product under EU legislation. It may be possible for it to obtain the CE mark and get an EU declaration of conformity and be placed on the market. But before we begin, the material the CMC must achieve end of waste status. Otherwise, it cannot become included as a component. And the end of waste, as people are aware, can be very, very confusing. And it's complex because unlike the FPR, which is an EU legislation, end of waste is it's operated at national level, basically. And there are a number of criteria that the material must have a distinct marketable product. In order to achieve end of waste status, you must have a distinct marketable product, and FPR can certainly provide that. A market or demand exists for such a product that can be established. It fulfills the technical requirements and meets the legislative requirements. This can be challenging, and it can be used with no worse impact than the material it replaces. But the journey may be becoming easier to achieve end of waste, because in 2019 and 2020, the EPA has produced a number of guidance documents. So they've produced guidance which introduce the end of waste, and they've also have a guidance document for people who want to complete an end of waste proposal. So the new fertilizer regulation also includes, as I said, soil improvers and growing media, but they've also introduced new safety criteria, particularly with respect to heavy metals. And because a key goal of this is to provide strict rules, as I said, on safety, quality, and labeling requirements. So, and this has implications for some heavy metals which were permitted under 2003 legislation, because the average phosphate fertilizers sold within the EU contain up to 36 milligrams per kg of cadmium relative to phosphate. And this has now been amended downwards for all products. So all products in the future will have to comply with the same requirements. So as I said, the fertilizers, they can be marketed as either national fertilizers or EC fertilizers. And if they're marketed as an EC fertilizer, then they can be distributed anywhere within the EU. So the EU fertilizing products, then, they're divided into what we call a number of different product function categories, or PFCs. And these are covered by Annex 1 of the legislation. The component materials, or CMCs, for the fertilizing products are also divided into categories, and these are covered under Annex 2. And as I said a few moments ago, Annex 2 is very, very much a work in progress. So the PFCs, or Annex 1. So this covers the product function categories, and it includes fertilizers, liming materials, soil improvers, growing media, inhibitors, plant biostimulants, and blends of PFCs. So PFC1, for instance, is a fertilizer. It can be an organic fertilizer, it can be an organomineral fertilizer, it could be an inorganic fertilizer. And within each of these three categories, there are subcategories. So for the case of organic, it could be a solid or a liquid fertilizer. Likewise, for organomineral, it could be a solid or a liquid fertilizer. For the inorganic, it could be a fertilizer where we declare its macronutrient content, or a fertilizer where we declare its micronutrient content. PFC2 refers to liming agents. PFC3 are soil improvers, and these can either be organic or inorganic. PFC4 are growing media. PFC5 inhibitors. PFC6 are plant biostimulants, and these can be either microbial or non-microbial. And PFC7 are blends of the above. So if we start by maybe having a look at the PFC1, and PFC1, as I said, is divided into two. We have PFC1A and PFC1B. So within PFC1A, these are organic fertilizers. And organic fertilizers must contain organic carbon. But the organic carbon could be peat, it could be lignite, or it could be liardonite. And these are mined products. So it must contain organic carbon, but the nutrients must be solely of biological origin. So the reason we can include the likes of peat and lignite is that these substances these materials basically contain humic substances, and humic substances can increase nutrient uptake. So that's why these are permitted. Now, I suspect under local national legislation here, peat may be challenging for if people want to include it within an organic fertilizer. So there are maximum levels of heavy metals, and for cadmium, it's very low. It's 1.5 milligrams per kg of dry matter. For chromium 6, it's 2. For mercury, it's 1. For nickel, it's 50. For lead, we're allowed 120. For arsenic, it's 40 ppm basically. For copper, it's 300. And for zinc, it's 800. So the copper is quite high because poultry litter in particular can contain significant quantities of both copper and zinc. And there's biuret, which is a product of the ammonium production industry, and that's not permitted. The legislation also has implications for it. Sorry, I beg your pardon. A requirement of the legislation is also that certain pathogens are tested for, and there's a testing regime outlined within the document itself, and it's very, very specific for both Salmonella and E. coli. So within the organic fertilizers, there are also 2 subcategories, and these are both solid organic fertilizers and liquid organic fertilizers. And for the solid organic fertilizers, it must contain a minimum of 1 to 2.5 weight% of the main nutrients, which can be N, P, or K. And you have to declare which one of these that you're referring to. So you can declare just a single, or you could declare multiple nutrients within your product, but the total nutrient content within the product must be greater than 4%, and there must be at least 15% organic carbon within the product. For liquid organic fertilizers, the nutrient content is lower, can be as low as 2%, but the total nutrient content must be a minimum of 3%, and there's a requirement that the carbon content within the product, in order for it to qualify as a liquid organic fertilizer, must be at least 5%. The PFC1 also includes what we call organomineral fertilizers, and these likewise are subcategorized into both solid and liquid organomineral fertilizers. And basically, these are a co-formulation of inorganic fertilizers as defined by PFC1C and an organic fertilizer. In other words, that they must contain organic carbon and nutrients of solely biological origin. And again, the organic carbon can be peat, it could be lignite. The overall nitrogen content is limited if we're using ammonium nitrate as the inorganic component, and it's limited to 16%. And again, there's very specific requirements in terms of heavy metals for both cadmium, which is 3, and it differs here because we're now adding inorganic components. So it's 3 milligrams per kg when the total phosphate is less than 5%, or when the total phosphate is greater than 5%, then 60 ppm, or 60, beg your pardon, milligrams per kg of phosphate is allowed. So it's 3% per kg of dry matter when it's less than 5%. But if we are using a lot of inorganic phosphate, then and the phosphate content is greater than 5%, then we can use 60 milligrams, but it's, in this case, it's per kg of P2O5, not dry matter. So for chromium 6, again, it's 2 mgs per kg of dry matter, and with nickel 50, lead 120, arsenic again 40. A higher quantity of copper is permitted, as you might expect, and a higher quantity of zinc, because we're now talking about materials of inorganic origin, and we are allowed to use biuret at a level of up to 12 grams per kg of dry matter. Again, pathogens will have to be sampled for in Salmonella and E. coli in particular. So there are two subcategories, which are, as I said, the solid and liquid organo-mineral, and these specify the levels of nutrients. So for the solids, it's 2 to 2.5% of the main nutrients. And again, that depends on whether you're declaring a single or multiple nutrients, but the total nutrient content must exceed 8%, and the organic matter must be a minimum of 7.5%. For the liquid, they must contain up to 2% of the main nutrients. And again, you can declare a single or you can declare multiple, and the total nutrient content must be greater than 6%. And the carbon content, organic carbon, must be 3%. So again, so when we're talking about macronutrients, we're using the old convention. So this has not changed. So also within PFC1, we have inorganic fertilizers. So with the inorganic fertilizers, we refer to these as PFC1C. Again, there are two categories. There are macronutrient fertilizers and micronutrient fertilizers. So basically the macronutrients will contain primary, which are NPK, or secondary, magnesium, calcium, sulfur, and sodium as their macronutrients. And these will have to be declared. For the micronutrients, they're boron, boron, cobalt, copper, iron, manganese, molybdenum, and zinc. And as you might expect, the limits for the metal contaminants in this case are obviously much higher than the other PFCs. PFC2, it refers to a liming agent, and the purpose here is that the product will adjust or correct soil acidity. These products can only contain oxides, carbonates, hydroxides, or silicates of calcium or magnesium. And again, there are levels specified for the heavy metals, and they also have to be tested they must meet minimum neutralizing and reactivity levels in order to qualify as liming agents. PFC3 is a soil improver. And this product didn't exist before, or couldn't be labeled before. And again, because it's a PFC, it must have a function, and the function is to maintain, improve, or protect the physical or chemical properties or the structure of the soil biology to which it's added. So, and there are two categories here: organic soil improvers and inorganic soil improvers. These organic soil improvers, 95% must be of biological origin. They must comprise 20% dry matter and 7.5% carbon. And they have the same main composition rules as for organic fertilizers. The PF3B, which is inorganic soil improvers, this can include mined materials such as sand, vermiculite, clays, etc. And again, these have the same will have to comply with the same composition and contaminant rules. So other forms of soil improvers will include materials such as biochars. So in biochar, we can produce through pyrolysis, and biochar is one of the products that can be applied directly to soil. And I won't go into the detail of it, but the claims that are made around biochar are extensive, but they include enhanced plant growth, but also the potential for carbon sequestration within the soil itself. And when it's in the soil, it can also reduce the losses of greenhouse gases from soil. So it is presented by its proponents, at least, as a win-win in terms of food, climate, etc. Okay, so PFC5 refers to inhibitors, and the purpose here is to improve nutrient release of a product by delaying or preventing the activity of specific groups of microorganisms or enzymes. So there are three subsections here, or three different types of inhibitors referred to here: nitrification inhibitors, denitrification inhibitors, and urease inhibitors. And there are specific requirements for each of these three types of products. PFC6 are plant biostimulants. Again, a new type of product. And the purpose here is to stimulate plant nutrition processes and independent of the nutrient content. The biostimulants must demonstrate that there's an improvement in either tolerance to abiotic stress, nutrients use, that the plants use the nutrients more efficiently, that there are improved quality traits within the plants themselves, and that it improves the availability of nutrients in the soil or within the rhizosphere. But this has to be done, has to be demonstrated independently of the nutrient content. So those are the listed materials in Annex 1. Annex 2, which I will always say is a work in progress. This refers to the component material categories, and this is where everything becomes a lot more complex. So the materials that can be used as components of the fertilizers under the new legislation, these are divided into 14 separate categories, and these can be used either on their own or they can be combined. So CMC1 is virgin materials, CMC2, plants, plant parts or plant extracts. So a lot of these do not pose any difficulty. CMC4, fresh crop digestate, CMC5, digestate other than fresh crop digestate, food industry byproducts, microorganisms. CMC8 are nutrient polymers, CMC9 polymers other than nutrient polymers, and these certainly are a work in progress. CMC10, which I will talk about, derived products within the meaning of the 1069, CMC11 byproducts, which differ from derived products within the meaning of Directive 2008. We have CMC12, which are precipitated phosphate salts and derivatives, mostly struvite. CMC13, thermal oxidation materials and derivatives, biochar, and CMC14 ashes. CMC12, 13, and 14 were, I suppose, originally identified as the materials most market ready by the JRC, because the Commission commissioned the JRC, which is their own research arm, to look at potential products which could be, or components which could be included as components under this new fertilizer regulation. And they produced a document in 2018, which they called Strubias. And this identified a number of CMCs. And the word Strubias comes from struvite, biochar, and ashes. So it's an acronym of these three, because these were identified as offering the potentially the most market readily materials. So CMC1, virgin materials, and this basically opens the door to many materials. Waste may not, in order to use certain types of waste products, as I said, you must achieve end of waste categorization or end of waste status. So the CMC1 Annex 2, it does include the specifications for chelating agents. It does include some specifications for inhibitors. According to the struvite document, sewage sludge should be allowed as an input material, but only for struvite and other precipitated phosphate salts, but also ashes and other oxidation materials. So it should be possible to use these for the Strubias materials. So we could either struvite, biochar, or ash. CMC2, it refers to plant parts or plant extracts. And so this requires them to be physically processed. So they must be processed by physical means. So we cannot process them chemically. So it involves crushing, milling, extraction with water, or extraction with CO2. CMC3, composting, but this currently excludes municipal waste, sewage sludge, and certain animal byproducts. CMC4 is specifically for fresh crop digestate, so specifically for plant or plant parts for the production of biogas. It does allow for some additives, but it's very limited. CMC5 digestate other than fresh crop digestate. So this does include biowaste, it does include dead organisms, but it excludes municipal solid waste or sludge currently. And then we have CMC6, which is food industry byproducts. So this includes food factory lime, which is permitted, molasses, vinasse, distilleries grain, lime from drinking water production. CMC7 refers to microorganisms. And at the moment, this is very, very restrictive. So I think this will certainly be very much a work in progress because the organisms may not have undergone any treatment other than drying or freeze drying. So there will be a lot more to follow on CMC7. I've jumped the polymers because again, those are very much a work in progress. And CMC10 is of interest because this refers to what we call derived products within the EC 1069. And this is specifically animal byproduct regulation. And the fertilizing regulation says that any EU fertilizing product may contain derived products within the meaning of 1069, having reached the endpoint in the manufacturing chain. And these three words or five words are very important. Endpoint in the manufacturing chain, but because this must be determined in accordance with 1069. So this can be a bit of a challenge. So if you go on to the JRC website, you can see that there are lots of questions being asked at the moment. So are manufacturers allowed to use derived products from animal byproducts, such as processed manure within EU fertilizing products? And basically, the response you get is that the FPR does create the framework for manufacturers to use products derived from animal byproducts, either as input materials for some component category materials, such as compost and digestate, or as a standalone component material belonging to CMC10. However, in both cases, there is a precondition. And the precondition is that the endpoint in the manufacturing chain for that derived product has to be determined by the animal byproduct regulation. So you must it must be permitted under the animal byproduct regulation. And that basically means getting, for at least for certain categories of animal byproduct, it requires EFSA approval. And I do know that at the moment, an amendment has been opened by EFSA, so they are beginning to look at this. If it can be, if the animal byproduct regulation can be amended. So CMC 11 refers to byproducts within the meaning of another directive. In this case, the directive is 2008. So for this, a CMC, so CMC 11 material should classify as a production residue. And the production residue is according to the waste framework directive guidance. In other words, as something other than the end product that the manufacturing process directly seeks to produce. So in other words, you cannot deliberately produce the waste. So for lots of production processes, there's more than one product. So it's possible to identify one or more primary products for which the process is intended. So the production, when we're producing, for a material to qualify as a byproduct, it cannot be a technical choice to produce it. It must be a residue of an intended process. So if I could give you an example, ammonium sulfate is produced, it's a byproduct basically. So it is a byproduct from the removal of ammonia. We use it for stripping ammonia from the gas that's produced from any type of pyrolysis process, mostly from the coking of metallurgical coal, because they pyrolyze they pyrolyze bituminous coal to produce metallurgical coal. And the stripping process basically consists of contacting the ammonia in the gas with sulfuric acid, and you produce ammonium sulfate. So this is a byproduct, because the main purpose of the pyrolysis is the production of metallurgical coal. There's a second route for the production of ammonium sulfate, and this is where we intentionally produce it so we synthetically synthesize it using the Haber-Bosch process, where we take the ammonia from the Haber-Bosch and we react it with sulfuric acid in a production plant to produce ammonium sulfate. So in this case, it is deliberately produced. So whether it's a product versus a byproduct, the first question that we ask is, was the material deliberately produced? And the second question that we must ask is, was the production process deliberately modified to produce a byproduct? Because this is not permissible. So you can see, and this is what I'm trying to illustrate here, that Annex 2 is quite complicated. So if I take an example of a CMC candidate material, the first question we ask is, was the material, so in terms of the input, here, so I'm inputting my material, was the material deliberately produced? Or was the production process deliberately modified to produce the candidate material? If the answer is yes, then it does not qualify as a CMC material. So we look at one of either CMC 1 to 5 or 8 to 10. If the answer is no, so we didn't deliberately produce it and we didn't modify the process, the next question is the candidate material a polymer? Is it a compost? Is it a digestate or derived for animal byproducts? If the answer is yes, then it goes back in and we must qualify it under one of the other CMCs. If the answer is no, then we ask ourselves some further questions. Can the candidate material be used directly as a fertilizing product component without further processing? If the answer to that is no, if it requires further processing, it is classified as a waste, and it will require end of waste status before it can be moved on. So, but if it does, if the answer is yes, then the candidate material, the next question is the candidate material produced as an integral part of the production process? Again, if the answer is no, then it's a waste. If the answer is yes, so in other words, that it arises as a byproduct when you're producing something useful. So then we're now into the FPR. So then we ask ourselves some further questions. Is the use of the candidate material certain? If the answer is yes, is the further use of the candidate material lawful? In other words, does it comply with respect to heavy metals, etc.? Then it's a byproduct, and now we can either qualify it as for a CMC, or if it's not compliant, it may be sold as a national fertilizing product. So you can see that this legislation is not simple. So point 1 of CMC 11 Annex 2 refers to, as I said, to animal byproducts. So sorry, it refers to byproducts, and the byproducts at the moment have exceptions because it excludes animal byproducts. So animal byproducts, so whether it's a derived product or a byproduct, you still have to go through 1069. And so this certainly slows the process up. So CMC 12 refers to precipitated phosphate salts and derivatives. And there are some restrictions here on this source. So it's allowed for wastewater and sewage sludges from municipal wastewater treatment plant, wastewaters from the processing of food, some beverages such as drinks, pet foods, animal feeds, or dairy products. It's permitted for certain types of bio-waste, but again, there are restrictions on the use of animal byproducts. So and this is interesting because it should be possible to mono-incinerate meat and bone meal, and the ash itself may qualify as a CMC, but it's also possible to take the ash and to produce either phosphoric acid or to produce or to recover struvite, and these would also qualify. But at the moment, under current legislation, all of those routes are currently prohibited. So CMC 12 so refers to struvite, CMC 13 biochar, and CMC 14 refers to ashes. So, and it tells us what we can recover them from, such as wastewaters, etc. There is quite an exhaustive list of input materials, and this is currently being amended, but for both CMC 12, 13, and 14. There are also there's amendments going through currently for the conditions of processing of bio-waste, etc. And also there will be some requirements that for some of these components will require REACH registration. So in other words, they will have to undergo chemical risk assessment, and they will need to undergo what we call REACH registration. So CMC 13, which is ones that I have a particular interest in, are basically the thermal oxidation materials and their derivatives. So at the moment, it excludes some municipal solid waste, some types of sewage sludge, some industrial sludges or dredged materials, certain animal byproducts, and certain bio-waste categories. So I'm going to leave it at that, and I'm going to try and answer any questions. My contact details are on top there if you want to email me with any specific queries. But my knowledge derives from reading the amendments as they come in, but even as of this morning, there were 4 further updates to Annex 2. So I'll try to stop sharing.
JJ, thanks very much for the presentation. It's really comprehensive, and I think the Annex 2 work in progress, it's reflected even in work by our own the European Sustainable Phosphorus Platform, which is currently sort of agitating in this space as well. So I'm conscious we had a slightly late start, so we might maybe open the floor for a few questions. We'll get through as many as we can, and then I'll hand back to Etain just to update everybody on the platform innovation voucher scheme. So first up is Akeem. Akeem, do you want to ask JJ your question there?
Hi there. I'm just curious about. I just saw the table of the ashes, the struvites, and so forth. And I noticed that if you have poultry litter or sewage sludge, if you make ashes from that, is it correct that means it can't be used as a fertilizer as of now?
As of it won't qualify under FPR at the moment, but it can qualify under national guidelines. So, for instance, there was a very large poultry litter incineration site in Moerdijk in the Netherlands, and the ash from that has been sold within the UK since 2008 because they have what's called poultry litter ash fertilizing guidelines in place. So, but you're absolutely correct. It does not qualify currently. This may change over the next few months under FPR current guidelines.
All right. It's just interesting because we have a European project at the moment called Renew to Farm, where we actually use struvites and these two ashes in field trial. And there is the discussion, of course, in the long term that when the project started, we expected that they would be under this legislation. But up to now, they still haven't. So the struvites are now there, but the ashes are still not there.
I think the issue there could be copper. If you look at poultry litter ash, the copper and zinc as well contents can be excessive. So, and I think some of the, so this is where a lot of work has to be done for the CMC in terms of inputs, because it is possible to modify the copper in the ash simply by reducing the copper in the feed to birds.
Thank you.
Thanks, JJ. I might ask one myself cheekily while we were waiting for the chat. In terms of the digestate characterization, JJ, particularly the non-digestate that's not exclusively plant-based,
yep.
Are the criteria for that in line with the other ones? In other words, are there nutritional, metal, and biologicals in mind?
There are. So there will be, they will have to, so if you're selling your digestate as an organic fertilizer, then you will have to conform to minimum content of organic carbon, minimum content of nutrients, and they will have to be tested for salmonella and E. coli.
Okay, very good. I think that has some process implication. A question from Aaron. Aaron, would you like to ask JJ your question?
Hi, JJ. Very quickly, just municipal food waste, as it is animal byproduct, it would be excluded from a CMC. How would that go about?
It's a very good question, and without dodging the answer, I think that, and this is dodging the answer, because the regulation 1009, the people in Ireland who are responsible for its implementation is the Department of Agriculture. And in order, because it's an animal byproduct, unfortunately, it will have to, it will fall under 1009 rather than FPR at the moment. And there's nothing, I would, and the reason is there are currently routes for getting those type of products onto the market through regulation 1009. And I think the Commission does not want, or wants to avoid as much as possible, overlap between potentially two pieces of legislation which down the road may lead to some ambiguity. I know I haven't answered your question.
No, I know it's not an easy one, to be fair.
It's a very difficult one because you have, and also the bodies which will be responsible for conformity or compliance. If in the case of the FPR, nationally, that's likely to be NSAI. However, for anything to do with 1009, it always has been and is likely to remain the DAF, the Department of Agriculture.
Yeah, so just hypothetically, if a facility was taking in that type of feedstock or waste stream, they would have DAF to regulate and to list the facility under animal byproduct approval. Once you have that approval, would you then, with that approval under your belt, go down the road and be able to then look at it?
You would, provided you could obtain end of waste status for the products.
I think there's the caveat, isn't it?
That's
the end of waste for food waste. I don't know any example in Ireland that is achieved.
None have gone through. So, and I think everyone is joining the queue to see who wants to be first in line. I've read the EPA guidelines, and they're easy if you have a simple material such as demolition waste or products, deconstructed materials, as I would call them. When you have food waste, I think it will be achieving end of waste status will present a more significant challenge.
The last thing I'd say is I know in the UK they have obviously PASS 100. And if I'm not mistaken, I could have read it incorrectly, that if you are to get PASS 100 certification, it is a de facto end of waste status. They put their name to the fact that you've achieved that, whereas we don't have the equivalent in Ireland. Is that correct?
That is correct. And so and something like that, if something like that was put in place, it would certainly accelerate getting a number of these products to market.
Brilliant. Thank you, JJ.
Thanks, JJ. Thanks, Aaron. I think engagement on the end of waste angle is something that the platform is keen to sort of engage with, and we may try and come back here for another webinar focused on that aspect actually in due course, and Etain will keep everybody up to date. I'm conscious of the time and we're a little bit late starting, but I might ask Katrina Power to ask her question and then hand back to Etain.
Thank you, Vincent, and thank you very much, JJ. Great overview today. We're working on a wool project, and it has been said that low-grade wool can be used as a fertilizer or even composting material. And so I'd just be interested to get your take there in relation to how would it fit into the regulations as you've described today.
So the first question I would ask is, it also fits, it's also included with an animal byproduct as skins. So again, it's probably the same answer as I gave the last time, that its permission for use will be determined by 1009 rather than the FPR. So it will first of all need to qualify under Regulation 1009. If it doesn't qualify under Regulation 1009, it certainly cannot be included as a CMC component under the new fertilizer regulation. And I don't know the specifics for sheep wool, I have to say, under the animal byproducts. Meat and bone meal I'm more familiar with.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, JJ.